Jeffrey Epstein Files, Epstein List, DOJ Epstein Files, Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein Island, Zorro Ranch, New Epstein Documents, Powerful Names, Sealed Records, Redacted Files, FBI Tips, and the victims who warned the government years before the world finally listened. That is where this true crime documentary begins. Not with one rumor, not with one celebrity name, not with one viral post. It begins with millions of pages released to the public, thousands of videos, thousands of images, heavily redacted records, anonymous tips, survivor reports, and one question that keeps getting darker the more you look at it. If the Epstein Files were supposed to finally bring answers, why did they create even more questions? Because inside these files are not only the names people expected. There are early warnings. There are reports that appear to show victims trying to speak before the system acted. There are documents with black boxes covering entire pages. There are references to famous people, private islands, Zorro Ranch, old FBI complaints, strange emails, and law enforcement failures that stretch across decades. And the most disturbing part is not that Epstein had secrets. Everyone already knew he had secrets. The disturbing part is that some of those secrets may have been sitting inside government systems for years, while more victims waited for someone in power to care. Before we go deeper, like this video and subscribe to True Crime Greyson. This story is built on records, public reporting, and verified case history. When a claim is not proven, it will be treated as unproven. Because in the Epstein case, the truth is already disturbing enough without turning rumor into fact. The new Epstein Files did not arrive as one clean book. They arrived like a maze. Massive datasets, long lists of documents, PDF files, images, videos, search tools that do not catch everything, handwritten pages that do not always show up in search, redactions that sometimes make a document impossible to understand. And because of the size of the release, even people who spent days going through the files could only see a small part of the full picture. The Department of Justice said the January release included over 3 million additional responsive pages under the Epstein Files Transparency Act. DOJ said the material included more than 2,000 videos and 180,000 images. Combined with earlier releases, the total production reached nearly 3.5 million pages. That number sounds like transparency. But transparency is not only about quantity, it is also about clarity. And the Epstein Files are anything but clear. The DOJ itself warned that some materials in the Epstein library may include disturbing content. It also warned that the library search tool may be unreliable, because some materials are handwritten or stored in formats that are difficult to search. That means a person searching a name, a location, or a date may not see every matching record. That matters, because in a case this large, what people cannot find can become almost as important as what they can. The new files also came with another warning that must be placed at the beginning of this story. The Justice Department and public reporting made clear that some materials could include untrue allegations, misleading material, or images that need context. A name appearing in the files is not proof of guilt. A photo is not proof of a crime. An anonymous tip is not proof that the claim happened. A calendar note does not prove what happened after the note was written. That is important, because this case sits at the dangerous edge between evidence and speculation. There are confirmed crimes. There are convicted defendants. There are survivor accounts. There are official court records. And then there are tips, claims, fragments, and references that investigators may not have verified. A responsible look at the new Epstein Files must keep those categories separate, because the victims deserve the truth, not exaggeration, not internet theater, not careless accusations that allow powerful people to dismiss the whole story as rumor. The story has to start with what is proven. Jeffrey Epstein was not only a wealthy man with strange friends and private homes, he was a convicted offender. He was later charged in federal court in New York with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking of minors. Ghislaine Maxwell, His longtime associate was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison for her role in a scheme involving Epstein and minor victims. That is not rumor. That is not a theory. That is court record. And that court record is why every newly released file matters. Because the public is not asking whether Epstein was innocent. The public is asking how he stayed protected for so long. The public is asking who knew, who failed, who looked away, who benefited, who kept taking the meetings, who kept visiting the homes, who kept treating Epstein as useful after he should have been shut out of every serious room in the world. The most powerful part of the new files is not the celebrity name people click on first. It is the early warning. One of the strongest documented examples involves Maria Farmer. Maria Farmer worked around Epstein in the 1990s. She later became known as one of the first people to report Epstein to law enforcement. A newly released FBI report connected to 1996 showed that she warned authorities about Epstein's conduct involving private images connected to her family. Public reporting says it is still unclear what the FBI did with that report. That is where the story turns cold. Because 1996 was not close to the end. It was before the Palm Beach investigation, before the 2008 plea, before the 2019 federal case, before the global headlines, before millions of people knew the name Jeffrey Epstein, before the world started asking how he got away with it for so long. If a warning reached law enforcement in 1996, why did it not stop him? Why did more victims have to come forward later? Why did Epstein continue moving through elite spaces? Why did a man already accused of serious misconduct keep building a world around wealth, access, travel, powerful men, and vulnerable girls? That question should sit over every part of this story. Because the Epstein Files are not only about what happened. They are about what did not happen when it should have. The next major public chapter came in Palm Beach. In 2005, Palm Beach police began investigating Epstein after a complaint from the parents of a young girl. The investigation expanded. More victims were identified. Police believed the situation was bigger than one incident. Federal authorities became involved. According to the Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility, federal prosecutors developed a possible case and a draft indictment. But the case did not move forward in the way many victims and advocates believed it should have. Instead, Epstein reached a controversial agreement. In 2007, federal prosecutors negotiated a non-prosecution agreement. Epstein later pleaded guilty in Florida state court. He served jail time and registered as a sex offender. For many people, this became the first major symbol of the system failing Epstein's victims. The deal allowed him to avoid a full federal trial at that time. It also left survivors with years of anger, confusion, and unanswered questions. How did a case with multiple alleged victims end in a deal that seemed so narrow? Why were victims not fully brought into the process before the agreement was signed? Why did a man with Epstein's resources receive a path that many ordinary defendants would never see? Those questions never went away. They only became louder, and after the new files, they feel even harder to ignore. Because every early report, every document, every law enforcement note, and every redacted page now carries the same implication. The warning signs were there. The system had chances. The system did not stop him. After the Florida deal, Epstein did not disappear. He continued living with extraordinary wealth. He maintained homes in New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and elsewhere. He stayed connected to people in politics, science, business, finance, universities, and philanthropy. That is the part of the story that still shocks people. A conviction tied to minors should have ended his social power, but it did not. He was still near powerful people, still exchanging emails, still hosting visitors, still moving between elite circles, still treated by some as a man who could provide access, money, introductions, or influence. And that is why the new files matter so much. They show fragments of Epstein's world after the point when the public already had reason to know he was dangerous. The files do not prove every person around him committed crimes, but they do show how wide his access remained. That alone is disturbing, because Epstein's power did not come only from secrecy. It came from proximity. He built himself around famous names. He collected relationships like armor. He understood that when powerful people took his calls or entered his homes, that contact could be used to make him look legitimate again. A meeting could become currency. A photograph could become currency. An email could become currency. A private invitation could become currency. Even if nothing criminal happened in one specific contact, Epstein could still use the connection to tell the next person, "Look who I know." And in elite circles, that kind of signal matters. The new files show that the story of Epstein cannot be told as one hidden basement or one island. It was a network of properties, a network of assistants, a network of money, a network of private travel, a network of social access, a network of people who now say they did not know, did not see, did not understand, or regretted ever being near him. Some of those explanations may be true, some may be incomplete, some may be impossible to verify, but the pattern is clear. Epstein stayed close to power after power should have rejected him. That is the frame for the new files. Not every name is guilty. Not every mention is evidence, but every documented connection helps explain how Epstein kept moving. By 2019, the pressure finally exploded. Federal prosecutors in New York charged Epstein with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking of minors. The country expected a trial. Survivors expected a public reckoning. For the first time in years, it looked like the full machinery of Epstein's network might be forced into court. Then Epstein died in federal custody. The official ruling was suicide. The Department of Justice Inspector General later found serious failures by staff at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. The report identified failures in monitoring, cellmate assignment, required checks, cell searches, record keeping, and camera recording. The OIG said those failures helped create the conditions that allowed Epstein to die in custody. The OIG also said it found no evidence contradicting the FBI's conclusion that Epstein's death was not caused by a criminal act. That is the official finding. But even with that finding, the damage was enormous. Survivors lost the trial. The public lost the chance to hear evidence tested in open court. Questions about Epstein's network became harder to answer, and the country was left with files, fragments, lawsuits, hearings, and redactions, instead of a full criminal trial against Epstein himself. That is why the new release carried so much weight. For many people, the files became the trial that never happened. But files are not a trial. They do not cross-examine witnesses. They do not prove every claim. They do not tell one clean story. They are records, leads, messages, reports, photos, and investigative materials collected across years. Some are powerful, some are unclear, some are disturbing, some are misleading without context. Some may include claims that were never verified. That is why the new release needs careful handling. The point is not to treat every document as gospel. The point is to ask why the full picture was hidden for so long. One major issue in the release is redaction. Some documents are heavily blacked out. Some pages appear almost useless because so much is hidden. Public reporting also described concerns that DOJ had identified more potentially responsive material than it released. Some lawmakers questioned whether the government had truly provided everything required under the law. That creates a second layer of tension. The public asked for transparency. The government released millions of pages. But the release still left people asking, what is missing? Why are some pages nearly blank? Why are some names protected? Why are some duplicate documents redacted in different ways? Why are some parts searchable and others not? Why are some images and videos difficult or impossible for ordinary people to review safely? This is not a small issue. In the Epstein case, redaction is not just paperwork. Redaction shapes what the public knows It decides which names remain hidden. It decides which events remain unclear. It decides which victims are protected, and which powerful people may avoid scrutiny. There are valid reasons to redact. Victims must be protected. Personal identifying information must be protected. Graphic or illegal material must not be spread. Ongoing investigations may require care. But when redactions appear inconsistent or excessive, public trust breaks further. And Epstein is already a case built on broken trust. The public remembers the Florida deal. The public remembers the lack of a full federal trial in the earlier case. The public remembers Epstein's death before trial. The public remembers Maxwell's conviction, showing that this was not imaginary. So when millions of pages come out with black boxes and unanswered gaps, people do not automatically assume the best. They ask, what else is being hidden? That is the emotional engine of the new files. Not certainty, suspicion, not proof of every claim. A record of enough failures to make the public doubt the institutions handling the truth. Inside the release, one category of documents requires extra caution: anonymous tips. The files include reports and complaints made to law enforcement. Some are disturbing. Some name powerful people. Some involve claims that cannot be verified from the public record. Some appear to be leads that may or may not have gone anywhere. These tips matter because they show what was reported, but they must not be treated as proven fact. A person can call in a tip. A person can make a claim. An investigator can document it. That does not mean the claim was proven. That distinction is critical, because the Epstein case has already become a magnet for speculation. Some people want every name and every file treated as guilty. Others want every claim dismissed as fake. Both reactions are dangerous. The truth sits in the work. Which claims were investigated? Which witnesses were contacted? Which records supported them? Which tips were dismissed? Which ones were ignored? Which ones could not be verified? Which ones pointed towards something real? That is where the story should go, not into reckless claims, into accountability. Because the existence of unverified tips still raises a serious question. Did investigators follow every credible lead? Or were some leads left behind because the names were too powerful, the politics too sensitive, or the case too difficult? That question becomes even sharper when the files touch Zorro Ranch. Zorro Ranch, Epstein's property in New Mexico, sits like a shadow over the new release. It was isolated. It was large. It had a mansion and private facilities. Survivors have connected it to Epstein's abuse. Public reporting has raised questions about whether it received the level of law enforcement scrutiny it deserved. New Mexico officials and lawmakers later pushed for a fuller investigation into the ranch and what happened there. That alone makes Zorro Ranch one of the most important locations in the wider Epstein story. Because Epstein's most infamous property may be the island, but the ranch carries its own unanswered questions. Who went there? What happened there? What did local and federal authorities know? Why was the property not fully understood earlier? Why did state officials later feel the need to reopen questions years after Epstein's death? New Mexico lawmakers launched a truth commission focused on the ranch. Later reporting said the commission issued subpoenas to several U.S. attorneys' offices, seeking information about whether prosecutors in different jurisdictions had information about Epstein and chose not to bring charges. That is significant, because it moves the question beyond Epstein himself. It asks whether institutions around the country had pieces of the puzzle. It asks whether those pieces were ignored. It asks whether the failure was local, federal, or national. And for survivors that matters, because survivor justice is not only about one conviction. It is about understanding how the abuse continued, while systems existed that were supposed to stop it. The new files also include many references to high-profile names. That is the part most people click on first. Politicians, business leaders, tech figures, royal figures, academics, financiers, celebrities. Some had social contact with Epstein. Some emailed him. Some were photographed around him. Some deny wrongdoing. Some say they regret knowing him. Some say the contact was limited. Some say they never saw criminal behavior. This is where the story must stay precise. Being named in the files does not prove criminal activity. Being photographed with Epstein does not prove criminal activity. Being invited somewhere does not prove criminal activity. Even traveling near Epstein or appearing in a calendar does not automatically prove abuse. But these records can still be important. They show Epstein's reach. They show who stayed near him after his conviction. They show how he kept access to people with influence. They show how he surrounded himself with names that helped him appear powerful. That is the bigger issue. Epstein's network was not only about who committed crimes. It was also about who gave him credibility, who made him look normal, who made him look connected, who made him look safe enough for the next person. That is why the files involving prominent people matter, even when they do not prove criminal conduct. They show how a convicted offender stayed inside elite life. One example that received public attention involved Howard Lutnick. Reuters reported that newly released emails appeared to show that Lutnick planned to visit Epstein's private island for lunch in 2012, years after he had claimed he cut off contact following an earlier encounter. Reuters also reported that Epstein's assistant sent a follow-up message afterward, and that a later email connected Lutnick to an invitation for a political fundraiser. A spokesperson said Lutnick had limited interactions with Epstein in the presence of his wife and had never been accused of wrongdoing. That is a careful, factual frame. The issue is not that the files prove Lutnick committed Epstein's crimes. The issue is that the files appeared to complicate his earlier public account of the relationship. In the Epstein story, that matters because credibility is everything. When powerful people minimize their connections, and documents later show more contact than they described, public trust breaks again. Another example involves Elon Musk. Reuters reported that emails showed Epstein and Musk discussed an invitation connected to Epstein's island, and that Musk asked about parties while declining a peaceful island visit. Reuters also reported Musk later said he had very little correspondence with Epstein and declined repeated invitations to go to Epstein's island or fly on Epstein's plane. Again, the safe point is not to claim more than the record proves. The record shows correspondence. It does not prove Musk committed a crime. It does not prove he visited the island. It does raise questions about why powerful people were still in Epstein's orbit after his conviction. That is the real story. Epstein's access did not end when it should have. The same careful approach applies to Bill Gates. Public reporting and statements have shown that Gates met with Epstein after Epstein's conviction. Gates said the contact was related to philanthropy and potential donors for global health. Gates has denied wrongdoing, denied visiting Epstein's island, ranch, or Florida home, and said meeting Epstein was a grave error in judgment. This matters because Gates is not just wealthy. He represents global philanthropy. So the question becomes moral and institutional. How did Epstein position himself as useful to a man whose public work focused on health and human welfare? The answer appears to be access. Epstein claimed he could connect wealthy donors. He presented himself as a gatekeeper. He used the language of philanthropy. And for someone like Epstein, that kind of contact could be valuable, even if no formal project succeeded, because he could use the association to make himself look legitimate. That is a pattern repeated across the files. Epstein did not always need people to commit crimes with him. Sometimes he needed them to take him seriously. A lunch, a meeting, a call, an email, a photo, a donor conversation, a private invitation. Each one could help him maintain the image of a man still connected to power. That image mattered. It helped him survive socially. It helped him move through rooms where he should have been unwelcome. It helped him present himself as too important to ignore. This is why the files are not only about scandal. They are about the mechanics of elite protection. Protection does not always look like a signed agreement. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a meeting that should not have happened. Sometimes it looks like a prosecutor choosing a narrow path. Sometimes it looks like a wealthy person deciding not to ask too many questions. Sometimes it looks like a black box over a name. Sometimes it looks like a warning from a victim that vanishes into a file. That is what makes the Epstein case so haunting. The harm was personal, but the failure was systemic. The victims were individuals, but the protection around Epstein was built from institutions, law enforcement, courts, wealth, politics, social circles, banks, private travel, elite philanthropy, media. And the deeper you look, the less this feels like one man acting alone in darkness. It feels like a man moving through systems that repeatedly failed to stop him. The new files also revived questions about possible intelligence connections and blackmail theories. These claims have circulated for years. They often involve Epstein's powerful contacts, hidden recordings, foreign intelligence theories, and the idea that compromising material may have been used for leverage. Some documents in the broader file universe include claims from sources or tips related to these theories. But caution is necessary. A theory is not proof. A confidential source report is not the same as a courtroom finding. An allegation in an investigative document does not mean the FBI proved it. The blackmail question remains important because it connects to something victims and observers have long suspected. Epstein may have gathered information on powerful people. Maria Farmer has publicly described hidden camera concerns inside Epstein's New York residence. Other reporting and survivor accounts have raised questions about surveillance. But a responsible telling should not claim the full blackmail theory as proven, unless the evidence supports it. The correct question is, was Epstein gathering information for leverage, reputation, control, or protection? That question is fair. It is also unresolved. And unresolved questions are not empty. They are the reason transparency matters. Because if Epstein used access to collect leverage, then his network was not just social, it was strategic. And if that is true, then every hidden camera claim, every strange email, every sealed record, every redacted name, and every unexplained contact becomes part of a much larger concern. But again, the point is proof, not vibes, not internet anger. Proof. That is why the new files are both powerful and frustrating. They reveal enough to raise hard questions. They do not always reveal enough to answer them. That gap is where public anger grows. One of the hardest parts of the release involves photos and videos. DOJ said the release included more than 2,000 videos and 180,000 images. But many of these materials are sensitive. Some include victims, or, potentially, private material. Some are redacted. Some should not be shared casually. Some should not be downloaded or reposted by the public. That part matters because the search for truth cannot become another violation of victims. People want answers, but victims deserve privacy. People want evidence. But the public does not need to spread images of victims to prove it cares. That is one of the moral tests of the new files. Can the public demand accountability without exploiting the same people who were harmed? That is why a survivor-centered approach matters. The focus should not be on showing the most disturbing material. The focus should be on what the material proves about systems, timelines, contacts, and failures. Who had access? Who handled reports? Which leads were followed? Which ones were not? Which properties were searched? Which ones were not? Which powerful people gave clear answers? Which ones changed their stories? Which institutions have still not explained their choices? This is where the story becomes bigger than Epstein. Because Epstein is dead. Maxwell is imprisoned. But the systems remain. The banks remain. The agencies remain. The political networks remain. The universities remain. The philanthropy networks remain. The law enforcement records remain. And the victims remain. They are still waiting for the full truth. At the center of that truth is a painful timeline. 1996. An early warning. 2005. Palm Beach police begin investigating. 2007. A federal non-prosecution agreement is signed. 2008. Epstein pleads guilty in Florida State Court. 2019. Epstein is arrested again in New York. 2019. Epstein dies in custody before trial. 2021. Maxwell is convicted. 2022. Maxwell is sentenced to 20 years. 2025. Congress pushes the Epstein Files Transparency Act. 2026. DOJ releases millions of pages. And after all that, the country is still asking what should have been answered years ago. Who protected Epstein? Not in a vague way, not as a catchphrase. In specific terms. Which offices had reports? Which prosecutors made decisions? Which investigators lost leads? Which powerful people kept contact after his conviction? Which institutions accepted his money or access? Which names were redacted? Which documents remain hidden? Which victims were ignored? That is the spine of this story. The new files are not the beginning. They are the reopening of every unanswered chapter. The release also changed how the public sees old claims. Before the files, some people dismissed questions about Epstein's network as conspiracy talk. After the files, the question became harder to dismiss, not because every theory was proven, but because the documents show how wide the network really was. They show how many people were near Epstein. They show how many records existed. They show how many agencies touched the case. They show how early some warnings may have reached authorities. They show how much information can stay buried until law forces it out. That is why this case is so dangerous for public trust. It tells ordinary people that powerful systems can fail for decades, and then when documents finally come out, those same systems expect the public to accept redactions without suspicion. That is a hard sell, especially when the victims were right all along. They said Epstein was dangerous. They said he had help. They said powerful people were around. They said the system failed. Years later, the files do not answer everything, but they prove the victims had far more reason to be heard than they were given. That is the tragedy. The victims were treated as problems to manage. Epstein was treated as a problem to contain. The public was treated as if it could not handle the truth. And now the files are out, but still incomplete enough to keep everyone asking what was held back. Halfway through this story, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The Epstein case is not only about hidden evil, it is about visible failure. A hidden crime is one thing. A visible warning, ignored by powerful institutions, is something else. That is why this story still feels alive, because every newly released record asks the same question in a different form. How much did they know? And how long did they know it? If you are still watching, like this video, and subscribe to True Crime Greyson. This case is hard to follow because the files are massive, the names are powerful, and the facts are often buried under redactions. We keep it clear, careful, and focused on the victims. The next part of the story is the gap between public release and public understanding. DOJ can release millions of pages, but most people cannot read millions of pages. They cannot download every file. They cannot verify every image. They cannot compare every duplicate document. They cannot track every redaction. They cannot know whether a missing search result means there is no document or the search tool failed. That creates a strange kind of transparency. The files are public, but the truth remains hard to reach. That is why independent journalists, researchers, lawmakers, survivors, and legal teams matter. They sort, they compare, they flag inconsistencies, they connect dates. They notice when one version of a document is more redacted than another. They ask whether the redaction protects a victim or protects someone powerful. And in the Epstein case, that distinction is everything. No one should expose victims. No one should spread illegal or private material. But powerful adults who helped, enabled, ignored, protected, or benefited from Epstein should not be hidden behind black ink, unless the law clearly requires it. That is where public frustration comes from. People are not angry that victims are protected. They are angry because they suspect powerful people are protected while victims remain exposed to pain. A group of survivors criticized the release process. saying the files placed survivors at risk while powerful men remained hidden. Lawmakers also raised concerns about whether the release was complete and whether the redactions were too broad. That criticism should not be treated as political noise. It is central to the case, because Epstein's victims have already lived through a system that failed to protect them. If the file release repeats that pattern by exposing survivor pain while hiding elite accountability, then the release becomes another wound. The new files also renewed attention on Zorro Ranch, because the ranch represents one of the clearest unanswered physical locations in the story. Epstein bought the property in New Mexico in the 1990s. It was large, remote, and private. Survivors connected it to abuse. Public reporting has stated that authorities searched other Epstein properties over the years, but state and local officials were not aware of a federal search of the New Mexico ranch. That raises a direct question. Why not? Why search other homes, but leave one of the most important properties so unclear? Why did later New Mexico officials have to push for answers long after Epstein's death? Why did a property connected to survivor accounts remain so under-examined in public view? New Mexico lawmakers later formed an investigative effort focused on the ranch. The point was not only to revisit the past. It was to ask what officials knew, what went unreported, and how the state could stop similar failures from happening again. That matters, because Zorro Ranch is not only a location, it is a symbol of isolation, a symbol of access, a symbol of land, wealth, privacy, and silence. The kind of place where a powerful man could bring people beyond the reach of ordinary scrutiny. The kind of place where victims could feel invisible. The kind of place that should have been searched thoroughly if investigators believed it held answers. The new files do not solve every question about Zorro Ranch. They sharpen them. And the sharper the questions become, the harder it is for officials to say the public should simply move on. The same is true for Epstein's Island. For years, the island carried a dark reputation in public memory. But in a legally responsible story, the island must be handled carefully. People may have visited for different reasons. A visit alone does not prove a crime. But the island remains important because it became a symbol of Epstein's private world, away from normal oversight, built around money, control, and access. The files include images and references connected to properties and visitors. But again, the strongest question is not, how many names can be shouted? The strongest question is, how did Epstein create private spaces where abuse could continue while powerful people moved in and out of his world? That question does not require exaggeration. It requires courage, because the answer may not be simple. It may involve failures by prosecutors, failures by investigators, failures by financial institutions, failures by social circles, failures by people who saw warning signs and decided not to act, failures by people who accepted hospitality and asked no questions, failures by institutions that treated Epstein as a donor, a contact, or a useful bridge. That is the machinery the files begin to reveal. A machinery of access. Epstein's access to young victims. Epstein's access to money. Epstein's access to famous names. Epstein's access to private properties. Epstein's access to elite events. Epstein's access to systems that ordinary people could never bend. And when access works like that, it becomes a shield against scrutiny, a shield against consequences, a shield against people who were telling the truth but lacked power. The files also show how dangerous it is when public attention focuses only on famous men. Famous names bring clicks, but victims bring meaning. The story should never become a game of which billionaire knew him, or which politician appears in a photo. Those questions matter, but they are not the soul of the case. The soul of the case is the girl whose warning was ignored, the survivor who testified years later, the woman who watched Epstein's name stay connected to powerful people while her own pain was treated like an inconvenience, the victims who were denied the full trial that might have exposed more, The people still waiting for a complete public record. That is why the new Epstein files should be read from the victims outward. Start with the harm. Then examine the system. Then examine the access. Then examine the names. That order matters. Because if the story starts with celebrity names, the victims become background. And in the Epstein case, victims were pushed to the background for too long already. One of the most painful parts of the case is that Epstein's death did not end the victim's fight. It changed it. Before his death, the fight was for prosecution. After his death, the fight became transparency. Maxwell's conviction brought some accountability, but not all of it. The victims still wanted answers about who else helped, who knew, who participated, who ignored, who covered, who profited, who stayed silent. That is why the files are not just archives. They are part of the justice fight. Every page may show a lead. Every redaction may hide a clue. Every email may reveal a relationship. Every calendar entry may place someone near a key event. Every report may show that someone warned authorities earlier than the public knew. That does not mean every document is explosive. Many are routine. Many are duplicates. Many are fragments. But in a case built on secrecy, even fragments matter. A fragment can change a timeline. A fragment can contradict a public statement. A fragment can show that contact continued after someone claimed it ended. A fragment can reveal that a victim spoke earlier than anyone admitted. A fragment can prove that a government office knew more than it said. That is why the release is so important. And that is why the release is so frustrating. Because the public has fragments, not a full picture. The new files also create a challenge for YouTube viewers, journalists, and creators. Some parts of the archive contain deeply sensitive material. Some involve minors or victims. Some should not be shown. Some should not be downloaded from unofficial sources. Some should not be reposted for clicks. The moral line must be clear. Victim privacy is not optional. The public can demand truth without spreading harmful material. The public can analyze file structures, dates, redactions, court records, and official statements without exposing victims again. That is how this story should be handled. The outrage belongs on the powerful, not on the victims. The attention belongs on institutional failure, not on graphic detail. The pressure belongs on agencies and adults who had power, not on survivors who already carried the cost. When you look at the files this way, the most important question is not, what is the most shocking document? The most important question is, what pattern do the documents reveal? And the pattern is this: warnings came early. Accountability came late. Powerful people stayed close. Redactions remain heavy. Survivors still want answers. That pattern is enough to carry the entire story. It is also enough to keep the audience engaged without reckless claims. Because every step raises the next question. If Maria Farmer reported Epstein in 1996, what happened to that report? If Palm Beach police found more victims in 2005, why did the federal case end the way it did? If Epstein pleaded guilty in 2008, why did powerful people still deal with him afterward? If he was charged again in 2019, why did he die before trial? If Maxwell was convicted, why has only one major accomplice faced that level of punishment? If DOJ released millions of pages, why do so many questions remain? If the files are meant to show transparency, why do redactions still dominate so many records? That is the structure of the story. It does not need artificial drama. The facts already build tension. The first act is early warning. The second is institutional failure. The third is elite access. The fourth is death before trial. The fifth is the file release. The sixth is the unanswered question. Who else should have been held accountable? This case also forces a hard conversation about how society treats powerful offenders. When ordinary people are accused of serious crimes, their lives often collapse instantly. But Epstein, even after conviction, still found pathways into elite circles. That difference is why the public remains angry. It suggests that wealth can soften consequences. It suggests that connections can reopen closed doors. It suggests that shame does not stick the same way to the powerful. It suggests that the system responds differently when the accused has money, lawyers, property, and famous friends. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is a question built from the public record. The Florida deal. The delayed accountability. The continuing access. The death before trial. The redacted files. Each part feeds the same concern. Would this have happened to someone without power? Would an ordinary offender have received the same treatment? Would an ordinary person have remained so connected after conviction? Would ordinary victims have been ignored this long if the accused had no elite network? Those questions are why the Epstein Files are more than true crime. They are a test of public faith. Faith in the FBI. Faith in prosecutors. Faith in courts. Faith in lawmakers. Faith in media. Faith in the idea that rich and poor answer to the same law. And right now, many people do not feel that faith. The new files did not restore it. They made it more fragile, because the public saw scale without closure. Millions of pages, but not enough answers. Thousands of images, but still no complete map. Videos, emails, reports, tips, redactions, and still the same question. Who protected Epstein? The high-profile names section should not be used as a list of accusations. It should be used as evidence of reach. Epstein's reach was extraordinary. He reached former presidents. He reached business leaders. He reached scientists. He reached academics. He reached financiers. He reached royalty. He reached philanthropists. He reached people who could shape policy, research, money, and public life. Some of those people have denied wrongdoing. Some have said they regret the association. Some have offered explanations. But the larger truth remains. Epstein was not isolated after his first conviction, and that is the scandal that does not require speculation. A convicted offender should not have been able to move so freely among people with that much influence. Yet the files show his world remained full of access. That access is the real evidence of elite failure. It is not proof that every person committed a crime. It is proof that the boundaries around Epstein were weak, and weak boundaries allowed him to keep power. Power is not always a title. Sometimes power is the ability to make people answer your email. Sometimes it is the ability to invite a billionaire somewhere. Sometimes it is the ability to host a scientist. Sometimes it is the ability to get a prosecutor's attention. Sometimes it is the ability to keep your name in elite conversation after your conviction should have ended your credibility. Epstein had that kind of power. The files show traces of it everywhere. That is why they feel so unsettling. Not because every trace is criminal, because every trace shows he was still in the room. At this point, the story must return to the unanswered law enforcement question. What did the FBI do with early reports? What did prosecutors do with the evidence? Why were victims not protected sooner? Why did some leads seem to go nowhere? Why did some properties receive more attention than others? Why did Zorro Ranch become a major question years later? Why did Epstein's death leave so many people feeling the truth died with him? The official record gives some answers. The DOJ OIG found jail failures. The OPR report reviewed the handling of the earlier Florida resolution. Maxwell was convicted. The new files were released under law. But those answers do not complete the story. They confirm failure without fully explaining responsibility. That is the gap. And the gap is what survivors keep fighting to close. For the victims, this is not history. It is lived memory. Every file release can reopen pain. Every redaction can feel like another locked door. Every famous name can remind them that Epstein had access they never had. Every public debate can turn their trauma into content. That is why the tone matters. The story must be intense, but not careless. It must be emotional, but not exploitative. It must name failures, but not invent crimes. It must challenge power, but stay grounded in records. Because if the story becomes reckless, It hurts the very people it claims to defend. The new Epstein Files have enough real material to build a powerful case for transparency. There is no need to embellish. The early report is real. The Florida investigation is real. The non-prosecution agreement is real. The 2019 charges are real. The jail failures are real. Maxwell's conviction is real. The massive file release is real. The redaction controversy is real. The Zorro Ranch investigation is real. The high-profile connections are real. The unverified tips are also real as documents, but not proven as events. That distinction is the line between serious reporting and dangerous speculation. A strong voiceover can say, "The files contain disturbing allegations," but allegations in a file are not convictions. The files contain famous names, but names are not proof. The files contain redactions, but redactions are not automatically a cover-up. The files contain enough documented failure to demand answers. That is the cleanest and strongest position, because it is fair, and because it is hard to dismiss. The final stretch of this story should make one thing clear. The new Epstein Files did not close the case. They reopened the public's demand for answers. They showed that the archive is huge, but the truth is still scattered. They showed that victims spoke earlier than many people knew. They showed that powerful people remained close to Epstein longer than the public expected. They showed that redactions still shape the story. They showed that Zorro Ranch deserves far more scrutiny. They showed that law enforcement failures were not side issues. They were central. And they showed that Epstein's greatest protection may not have been one person. It may have been a culture that treated wealthy men as exceptions, a culture that treated victims as problems, a culture that treated elite access as more important than public accountability, a culture that allowed a convicted offender to keep moving because too many people found him useful. That is the most frightening part. Not one secret file, not one famous name. The system around him. The people who helped directly must be exposed through evidence. The people who failed through negligence must be held accountable through records. The institutions that missed, ignored, buried, or mishandled reports must answer publicly. And the victims must not be forced to keep fighting alone for a truth the government should have pursued long ago. The story begins with millions of pages, but it ends with one question. If the files contain this much, what did the victims try to tell us years before the files ever came out? Because long before the public searched Epstein's name online, survivors were speaking. Long before the new release, survivors were warning. Long before the headlines, survivors were carrying the truth. And the truth did not fail because it was weak. It failed because powerful systems did not act fast enough. That is what the new Epstein Files reveal. Not every claim, not every rumor, not every name, but the shape of a failure so large that millions of pages still cannot contain it. Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison, but the questions remain alive. Who else helped? Who else knew? Who else lied? Who else looked away? Who else used Epstein while pretending not to see who he was? Who else had the chance to stop him and did nothing? And how many victims paid the price while powerful people protected themselves? That is why this case still matters. That is why the files matter. That is why the redactions matter. That is why Zorro Ranch matters. That is why Maria Farmer's early report matters. That is why every verified record matters. Because without records, the powerful control the story. And for too long, the Epstein story was controlled by people with power. Now the files are out. Not all of them clearly. Not all of them cleanly. Not all of them without problems. But enough to show that the public was right to demand more. Enough to show that survivors were right to keep pushing. Enough to show that the system has not answered for everything. And enough to prove that this story is not finished. If you want more carefully researched true crime stories that follow the records, protect victims, and ask the questions powerful people avoid, like this video and subscribe to True Crime Greyson. Because the most chilling part of the new Epstein files is not only what they reveal, it is what they still do not explain. Why did the warnings fail? Why did the access continue? Why were some records buried for so long? Why are some pages still hidden? Why did victims have to fight this hard to be believed? And why does the truth about Jeffrey Epstein still feel like it is being released one blacked-out page at a time?